the silent town that no one dares enter. There's a place up in the hills, nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains, where the air smells different. People say it's the trees, the way the thick woods grow so close together, their twisted limbs blocking the light, trapping the wind in between like it's afraid to escape. This place, they say, is where the earth itself keeps its secrets. But there's one secret the land hasn't given up yet. And that secret, well, that secret is the silent town. You won't find it on any map, but the old-timers swear it's real. And there's a story told in hushed voices whenever the sun starts sinking low and the shadows stretch long across the land. The story goes that there once was a town called Echo Hollow, a bustling place filled with folk who lived like any other. The families there were hard-working, salt-of-the-earth types, just like in any small town, just like your own. And for years Echo Hollow thrived. But then one summer something happened. The crops, which had always flourished in the rich soil of the valley, began to wither. The wells, once brimming with clear, cool water, ran dry. And the animals, well, the animals started disappearing. No one knew why or where they went. And those who tried to investigate would return with pale faces and frantic eyes, too terrified to speak of what they'd seen. By the end of that summer, people started vanishing. One by one, the residents of Echo Hollow disappeared, gone without a trace. It wasn't like they packed up and left, no sir. The houses were left behind, their doors wide open, food still cooking on stoves. There were no signs of struggle. No signs of anything. They just vanished like the earth had swallowed them whole. The town grew eerier by the day, and before long there was no one left. The town that had once thrived now sat silent, empty, a hollow shell of itself. And that was when the strange things began. It was said that, on certain nights, when the moon hung low and full, you could hear the faintest whispers drifting through the trees. Some folks from nearby towns, brave or foolish, would venture near the old town, curious to see what remained. But they'd never return. At least not the same way they went in. One such man, a lumberjack by the name of Thomas, was among those who dared. He was known to be a hardy soul, not afraid of any of the things that most folks trembled at. He'd heard the stories, of course. Who hadn't? But he figured they were just tall tales, meant to scare children around campfires. He laughed at the idea of ghosts and curses, for he'd seen much worse in his years cutting through the thick woods. So, on a brisk autumn morning, Thomas set out, axe on his back and a pack of supplies on his shoulders, to find Echo Hollow and prove once and for all that it was just a story. He followed the old trail into the woods, the path overgrown with brambles and vines that seemed to close in on him with every step. The deeper he went, the darker it got. Even in the late afternoon, the canopy of trees was so thick that the sunlight barely pierced through. The air felt heavy with something unseen, something watching from the shadows. But Thomas shook off the growing unease, thinking it was nothing more than the wilderness closing in around him. As he approached the town, he began to hear it, the whispers. Soft, distant voices as if carried on the wind. They were faint, like murmurs from the past, drifting just out of reach. Thomas paused, listening, but could make out nothing clear. He tried to convince himself that it was just the wind, that his mind was playing tricks on him. But there was something about the sound that made his skin prickle. It wasn't normal. And then he saw it. The town of Echo Hollow, just ahead, looming out of the woods like a forgotten dream. The buildings were standing tall but abandoned, their wood bleached by time and weather, the windows dark and empty. No sound came from the town, no birds, no rustling leaves. The silence was so thick it felt like it pressed against his eardrums, a heavy, suffocating blanket that made it hard to breathe. Thomas took a few cautious steps forward, his boots crunching on the dry earth. He could feel the weight of the silence pressing on him, but he pushed on. As he walked through the main street, his eyes caught sight of the old church at the end of the road. Its doors hung ajar, creaking ever so slightly in the wind that wasn't there. The shadows around the building seemed darker, somehow as if they didn't belong to the trees or the structure. As if they were moving, shifting on their own. He moved toward the church, his curiosity outweighing the caution he should have felt. The door groaned as he pushed it open, revealing the interior. The air inside was thick, musty with age and neglect. Dust hung in the beams of sunlight that filtered through the cracked windows, casting strange, elongated shadows across the pews. Everything in the church seemed frozen in time, as though the people who had once gathered there had simply stopped mid-prayer and walked away. But there was something wrong. It wasn't just abandoned, it was forgotten. And that's when Thomas saw it. At the far end of the church, near the altar, a single figure stood. At first, Thomas thought it was another person, perhaps someone who had come to see the town for themselves. But as he stepped closer, the figure did not move. It was a tall man dressed in a long, tattered coat, but his face was completely blank, no features at all. Just a smooth, pale surface like a doll. His hands hung limp by his sides, and his head was tilted unnaturally to one side, as if he were looking directly at Thomas. But the eyes, if they could even be called eyes, were black empty sockets that seemed to swallow all light. The air grew colder and Thomas felt his breath catch in his throat. His feet felt rooted to the floor, his muscles stiff with terror. The whispers grew louder, now not just in the wind, but all around him, rising in intensity until they filled his ears. "Leave now." The voice was a low growl, but it wasn't from the figure, it was from everywhere. The church seemed to pulse with the sound, and the shadows around him deepened, closing in like a suffocating fog. But Thomas was not one to run, not without understanding what was happening. He took a step forward, reaching out with a trembling hand toward the figure, but the moment his fingers touched the air in front of it, the figure vanished, disappeared into thin air, leaving nothing but the oppressive silence behind. The whispers stopped. For a long moment Thomas stood there, unable to move, unable to breathe. But then he heard something else, a faint, distant sound like the sound of footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, coming closer. His heart hammered in his chest as he turned around, but there was no one behind him. No footsteps. No sound. Only the echoes of his own breath in the church. But as he turned back to leave, he noticed something new. The door, the one he had entered through, was no longer there. The frame was empty, as if the building itself had swallowed it whole. He was trapped. Suddenly the whispers returned, but this time they were different. The voices weren't just murmuring, they were crying, screaming, pleading. "You shouldn't have come, you shouldn't have come." The shadows thickened, twisting around him like tendrils, closing in, suffocating him. Thomas tried to move, to fight, but it was no use. The town had claimed him. And just like the others, he too would vanish without a trace, swallowed by the mystery of Echo Hollow. And when the sun rose the next morning, there was no sign of Thomas. No footprints. No blood. No sound. Only the thick, suffocating silence that had always been there. The eyes of the town. The town remained still, undisturbed by time. Days passed, and the sun climbed higher, casting an orange glow over the trees that surrounded Echo Hollow. To the outside world, the town was still nothing more than a forgotten memory, a name whispered by those who feared to speak too loudly. Yet Echo Hollow was not as empty as it appeared. It never had been. The story of Thomas, the lumberjack who had ventured too far, spread quickly through the neighboring towns. But like all tales of this cursed place, it was met with disbelief, skepticism, and fear. People spoke of it in hushed tones, avoiding the subject whenever the conversation drifted toward it. But no one dared enter the woods, no one dared approach the hollow. Not after hearing the stories. Not after hearing the warning. But not everyone listens to warnings. Ella, a young woman from the neighboring town of Briarwood, was different. She wasn't one to simply believe in old stories or ghost tales spun by frightened townsfolk. No, she was a skeptic at heart. Practical. Logical. She had grown up with the stories of Echo Hollow, of course, but she never let them sway her. She had even heard the faint whispers of the town's curse from her grandmother, who had lost an uncle to the town's strange happenings. But Ella was no child. She was determined to see for herself if the town really was cursed, or if it was just another piece of folklore, built up by years of wild imaginations. When Ella heard the story of Thomas, the lumberjack who disappeared into the town and was never seen again, she felt a coldness in her stomach. Something about it unsettled her more than it should have. Still, she packed her bag, took her coat, and set off into the forest. The echoes of the whispering town faint in her mind, like an old song she couldn't quite shake. As she ventured deeper into the woods, the trees grew thicker, their twisted branches blocking out most of the light. The forest seemed to swallow her whole, the path disappearing beneath her feet. But she pressed on, undeterred by the growing feeling that the world around her was beginning to shift. The wind, which had been a gentle breeze before, now carried an odd heaviness, as though the very air was thick with something unspoken. And the further she went, the quieter it became. Not a single bird sang, not a single rustle of an animal stirred the underbrush. And then she saw it. Echo Hollow. The town sat at the base of a ridge, a collection of old wooden houses with cracked windows and crooked doors. There were no people. No movement. The buildings stood still in the thick fog that rolled across the valley, like ghosts themselves frozen in time. The silence was suffocating, thick, and unnatural. It felt as though the town were holding its breath, waiting. Watching. Ella felt her heart quicken, the pit of her stomach tightening. She had come this far, but standing there at the edge of the town, she wondered for the first time if this was a mistake. What was it that had taken Thomas? And the others before him? She stood for a long moment, staring at the town, debating whether to step forward. Then, gathering her courage, she walked toward the main street. The houses were derelict, abandoned. The doors hung open, revealing dark, empty interiors. Her footsteps echoed in the stillness, each one a sharp reminder of how alone she was. She passed a small chapel, its bell tower crooked and leaning, as if the building itself had been tilted by time. The door to the chapel creaked open as she approached, though no wind was present. The air seemed unnaturally still, and her breath caught in her throat. The door swayed slightly, beckoning her inside. Without thinking, Ella stepped through the threshold. The interior of the chapel was dim, the light filtering through broken stained glass, casting eerie, fractured patterns on the wooden floor. Dust lay thick on the pews, and the smell of old incense hung in the air. But it wasn't the dust or the smell that made her shiver. It was the feeling. The overwhelming, oppressive sense that she was not alone. As she stepped deeper into the chapel, the floorboards creaked under her weight. It felt like the town itself was waking up, like the buildings, the very earth beneath her feet, was coming alive with a hunger she couldn't name. A sudden noise, like a distant whisper, broke the silence. Ella froze, her breath catching. It was a voice, low and indistinct, but it was there, right behind her. "You shouldn't be here." She whipped around, her pulse racing, but there was no one. Only the emptiness of the chapel staring back at her. Her heart hammered in her chest, her mind racing. She had to get out. But before she could turn toward the door, a figure appeared in the shadows. A man, his form barely visible, standing in the corner of the chapel. He was tall, wearing old, tattered clothes, but his face was completely blank. No eyes, no mouth, just smooth, pale skin. The air around her grew colder, and the whispers grew louder, rising like a chorus of forgotten voices. Ella couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The figure took a step forward, and the shadows seemed to stretch and writhe around him, as though they were part of him, his very being entwined with the darkness. "You are not meant to see," the figure intoned, its voice an eerie, hollow echo. Ella tried to back away, but her feet felt rooted to the ground. The whispers rose to a deafening pitch, their words twisting and tangling in her mind. Her vision blurred, and she could feel something pulling at her, something dark and ancient, like the town itself had reached out and latched onto her. With every ounce of strength she had left, Ella tore herself away from the figure, running toward the door. The air pressed against her, the shadows clawing at her heels as she sprinted into the streets, not daring to look back. The whispers followed her, louder and more insistent now, as if they were coming from the very walls of the town itself. She didn't stop running until she reached the edge of the forest, the town now a distant memory behind her. But even as she stood there, gasping for breath, she knew it wasn't over. The town hadn't let her leave. It had shown her its face, its truth. And there was no escaping what she had seen. Echo Hollow wasn't just abandoned. It was alive, waiting for those who dared to walk into its silence. Waiting for those who would vanish into its depths, never to be heard from again. Ella's eyes darted to the horizon, where the fog clung to the mountain's edge. The town's pull still lingered in her mind, an unshakable presence that would follow her for as long as she lived. For now she was free. But she knew deep down that Echo Hollow would never let go. Not really. Not forever. And the next time someone dared to enter, the town would be waiting. The eyes that watch. Weeks passed after Ella's return to Briarwood, but the memories of Echo Hollow never truly left her. They lingered in the corners of her mind like the whispers that filled the town, following her wherever she went. Every time she closed her eyes, she could still see the blank figure in the chapel, its pale face staring at her without expression, without mercy. And those whispers, they never stopped. Every time the wind howled through the trees, it felt like the town itself was calling her name. Ella tried to move on. She returned to her life, but something had changed. The townsfolk noticed it too. She no longer laughed like she used to. She no longer wandered the woods with the same carefree attitude. Her once bright eyes had dimmed, weighed down by something that couldn't be explained, not even to her. She had been marked by something dark and ancient that the town of Echo Hollow had unleashed upon her. And it wasn't just Ella. The townspeople of Briarwood started to change too. The shadows in their homes seemed to stretch longer, the nights growing colder. Some of them claimed to hear strange noises, footsteps outside their windows, whispers in the trees. And when they turned to face the source of the sounds, there was nothing there. Only silence. One night, Ella was standing by the window of her small cottage, watching the mist roll in over the hills. The moon was full, casting a pale, ghostly light across the land. It was the same moon she had seen on the night she ventured into Echo Hollow. The same moon that had witnessed Thomas's disappearance and countless others before him. As she stood there lost in thought, she heard it, the faintest sound like a soft rustling in the distance. At first she thought it was just the wind. But then it came again, closer this time. The whispering voices, low and distant as if calling from deep within the earth. Ella's heart skipped a beat. She turned, instinctively looking toward the door. The air in the room had grown colder, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should have. The silence outside had deepened, and the woods, which had always been so familiar to her, now seemed to pulse with an unsettling energy. The whispers grew louder, almost frantic, as if something was trying to break through. She rushed to the door, pulling it open just as the wind howled and the earth trembled beneath her feet. She looked into the darkness, her breath catching in her throat as she saw them. The figures standing at the edge of the forest. They were no longer the faceless beings of Echo Hollow. These figures had eyes, eyes that glowed with an eerie light, eyes that seemed to pierce the very fabric of the night. There were more of them now, standing in the shadows just beyond the reach of her porch light. Their forms shifted, flickered like smoke, as though they were both part of the land and something separate from it. Ella felt her heart race as she realized what they were, what they had always been. The town wasn't just cursed. It was alive. And it had been waiting for her. As she stepped outside, the air grew colder, the wind howling around her, filling her ears with the constant whispering that seemed to come from all directions. The figures didn't move, but their eyes followed her, unblinking, watching her every step. She could feel them closing in, their presence a suffocating force, a weight on her chest that made it hard to breathe. "You shouldn't have left," one of the figures spoke, its voice like the rustling of dry leaves. The sound of it sent a chill down Ella's spine. She wanted to run, to hide, but her feet felt frozen to the ground, as if the earth itself had a hold on her. "Echo Hollow doesn't forget," the voice continued. "And neither do we." Ella's breath caught in her throat as she realized that the town had followed her. Not just in her memories but in her very being. The curse of Echo Hollow had left its mark on her, and now it was coming to claim her. But then something shifted. Something in the way the figures moved, no longer standing still but circling her, closing in from all sides. Ella could feel the air growing heavier, the whispers becoming more frantic. The ground beneath her feet seemed to pulse, like a heartbeat, slow and steady. And then, as if in response to some unseen command, the figures stepped forward. Ella gasped, her hand instinctively reaching for her chest, where the necklace had once rested. She could feel the stone, still there, still pulsing with a dark energy. The stone she had once torn away from her neck in a desperate bid for freedom. She could feel it now, pressing against her skin, as if it were calling her back to the town. Back to the darkness. The figures moved closer, their eyes locked on hers. "You belong to us now," they intoned, their voices in unison like a single, collective being. Ella closed her eyes, the pressure building in her chest as she felt the town, the land itself, drawing her in. She had known it would come to this. She had known the town wouldn't let her go so easily. Echo Hollow had claimed her soul the moment she stepped foot inside its cursed streets, and now there was no escaping. The whispers grew louder, their voices melding into one, until they became a single cry, a wail of despair. Ella could feel herself being pulled, her feet dragging against the earth, her body unwillingly moving toward the town that had once seemed so far away. The figures followed, their eyes never leaving her, their whispers guiding her step by step. And as the town loomed before her once more, the fog swirling around the houses like ghostly fingers reaching out to embrace her, Ella understood the truth. Echo Hollow was not just a town. It was a living entity, an ancient force that had been there long before she arrived, and would remain long after she was gone. The town had always been waiting, for the curious, for the brave, for the foolish. And now it had claimed her. The last thing Ella saw before the fog swallowed her whole was the hollow eyes of the figures, watching her with the same emptiness that had consumed the town long ago. And in the silence that followed, the whispers faded, leaving only the hollow, aching stillness of Echo Hollow. The town once more was silent.